Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session today. You are definitely in for a treat. JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Strategies for RDOs. Today, you will hear from our three phenomenal panelists who will discuss best practices, challenges, opportunities, and ways to collaborate on how to incorporate JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion within their own RDOs and in the community. I am Jasmine Kilpatrick with Local Government Federal Credit Union. I will be the moderator for this session. I am a JEDI advocate and I host a DEI podcast, Brunch with Jazz. My knowledge and passion for this content stems from my career in local government and the credit union industry. Local government entities should be the catalyst for implementing DEI, from employment, services to citizens, effective policing, housing, economic development, and so much more. RDOs play a vital part of that process. So at this time, I will turn it over to our wonderful panelists. They're going to introduce themselves and they're going to share how their region reflects JEDI. We will start with Cheryl, followed by Lisa, and then Charlie.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Cheryl Hills with Region 5 Development Commission in Central Minnesota. Thank you, NADO family, for having this topic on the conference agenda. And thank you, Jasmine, for hosting. I'm honored to be here and talk a little bit about this work. Region 5 Development Commission, just for real quick context, we have some historical relevancy into this work. We, as Minnesota RDCs, were all established about 50 years ago via state statute to do much of what y'all do in terms of developing plans and programs and implement programs. And part of that statute reads that we will encompass physical, social, or economic needs of the region. So we also, in recent history, our own organization with that statute in hand and taking all of those areas very seriously. Back in 2010, some of you all know that we participated in some sustainable communities work that really embraced the triple bottom line approach, which of course one of those areas is quality of life for all people. We took that very seriously. And in 2014, NADO funded our organization to get some training, WealthWorks training, which was very important for us in our journey, which it takes an intentional focus, that model does, on social and cultural capital, livelihoods, and ownership, which also sort of forged us into this work, Jasmine. I'm intentional about mentioning that our priorities, we certainly started with these regional and legislative values in hand, but we eased into our work in some three easy, comfortable entry points. We started with some summits and discussions focusing on our employers and sharing demographics. Lots of folks have done this, hiring pools, how to create inclusive workplaces. We moved to some creative placemaking work that was initiated around our ag economy and local foods, safe places for our local units of government, as you said, Jasmine, and our residents to talk about diversity and inclusion of all folks. We did that through our growers and makers marketplace. And then we did some little bit of more placemaking work in towns that were doing transportation projects, downtown projects where they needed some diversity, artists and various cultures being explored. The end of my introduction really shares a little bit about our journey and how we then in 2018 divested in what's called the Intercultural Development Inventory Assessments. 3 of our staff became qualified assessors of that tool, that developmental tool. And our commission started with taking that assessment and learning more about our internal journey, which we can talk about later. But this transformed in 2019. We launched a Welcoming Communities program where we started with welcoming community advocacy groups. And briefly, I'll just share with you, that was 8 community groups in our 5-county region, about 50 folks from the region. Each group received an IDI assessment first to have some shared terms, understanding of what we were talking about and where they were in their journey and and they moved on to about, from those groups, they met quarterly and they would talk more about diversity, equity, inclusion and what that meant for their communities. And they started to work on a project where they could exemplify What does it mean in my community to be welcoming, and what does that look like? To summarize real quickly, we've delivered to 20 local units of government and nonprofit this IDI assessment, which totals over about 250 folks in the region. 90 of those individuals have gone on to do their own individual assessments and work that got our conversation started. And lastly, I'll mention, we've done a lot more work, but as part of the IDI, 2 of our community colleges have hired Region 5 to deliver these assessments and do goal setting with their leadership teams at each of the colleges. So I'll stop there. I appreciate being here. Thanks, Jasmine.
Thank you, Cheryl. Lisa? Lisa, if you could go next, thank you. Well, it might be, there we go.
So I don't know if I've been going offline a lot, so I'm having some internet connectivity problems this morning, so hopefully this will work. Good morning, everybody. My name is Lisa Dawson, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I serve as the Executive Director of the Northeast Oregon Economic Development District. And for context, we serve rural and remote counties, 3 rural and remote counties in Northeast Oregon, with a total population of about 50,000 people and 9,000 square miles. Our region is mostly white, with white alone population percentages varying between 92 and 95.5%. So our organization is small. We have 4 staff, and 3 of them are part-time, and 2 of us are doing most of the work around delivering programs and providing technical assistance in the types of community and economic development work that we do. So our journey towards DEI probably started in 2008, where we started providing individual development accounts to low and moderate income individuals. And in 2013, a couple of our staff members became involved with the Oregon Community Food System Network, and that network is primarily consistent of organizations that are on the western part of Oregon, and they included a significant number of equity trainings and collaboration with people of color, and staff was able to start talking about issues that had previously been taboo. In 2016, staff started to participate in a really newly formed local equity group that was experiencing turmoil, and that group quickly dissolved. But with a grant from one of Oregon's largest and most influential foundations, our organization started offering equity educational programming. So since then, we've been hosting quarterly nonprofit roundtables on various subjects, and those topics have been on things such as DEI assessment, LGBTQI 101, understanding and interrupting microaggressions, implicit bias, encouraging diversity without tokenism, understanding racism, allyship, and white privilege. And for those nonprofit roundtables, we've brought in trainers, mostly people of color, to teach and lead the discussions. We also have traditionally offered a 4-session organizational development and grant writing program for nonprofits, and we adapted that program to include trainings on modules on DEI topics within each of the 4 sessions. And last year, we developed a multi-session Journey to Equity workshop designed to help nonprofit organizations understand DEI concepts, assess their DEI status, develop an equity plan, a DEI statement, and practice using an equity lens. And although this was designed to support the nonprofit community, one of our for-profit low-income housing developers asked to participate in the workshop because they received funding from USDA Rural Development and needed to show some progress on DEI issues. And other things that we've done, we've also developed a partnership with the Oregon Native American Chamber to deliver their Oregon Native Entrepreneur Business Curriculum, and recently have developed relationships with other cultural specific organizations to influence the expenditure of state funds for businesses in response to COVID-19. Internally, we've had discussions with our board, tried to integrate something on a DEI concept at each board meeting, and a board subcommittee helped us create an equity statement for our organization. And we've tried to make sure that a recent job opening was available for more diverse applicants. And in response to public requests, we partnered with Oregon Humanities to host public conversations on equity topics. So that's what we've been up to.
That's awesome. Charlie, if you want to introduce yourself and tell us what you have going on.
Sure. Charlie Baker, Executive Director with the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission in Northern Vermont, or the Burlington, Vermont region. And compared to where Cheryl and Lisa are, we're at the very beginning of this conversation, but I'll tell you some of what we've been working on anyway. Quick facts about Chittenden County: 160,000 population, about 100,000 jobs. We are the employment center for Vermont, for what it is. It's a small state. It's only 600,000 people in the whole state, but we have about a third of the employment and 25% of the population. We have, we're also a university town. We have 5 colleges. About 50% of our residents have a college degree, so highly educated, higher incomes. We have 20,000 college students. But the state is pretty white. It's 95% white. Our county is a little bit more diverse. We're 88% white. So in general, our economy is good. However, and I think this really started to come out, like Cheryl, we got one of those sustainable community grants in 2010. And there was a focus on equity there. When we started looking at some of our data with our partners, some pretty startling pieces of data came out, like for median household income, $75,000 for the county. Sounds great. However, if you're an African American in my region, it's $37,000. It's half, less than half. And then this isn't a perfect surrogate for race, but if you're a low income student in my region and we test a 3rd grade reading proficiency, if you're white, if you're higher income, it's 67% proficient. If you're low income, 32%. Those are just a couple big data points that we grabbed onto. We are a refugee resettlement community, so that's a factor in some of these things, but those are pretty startling numbers to me and to our partner organizations. I think I may have said we had 60 organizations working with us on our plan. And so as we worked on our plan at that time, it really became clear we weren't going to achieve our other community goals unless we addressed equity. In our plan, we actually combined, we have a state required regional plan, the CEDS, and our MPO transportation plan into one plan. And so equity became one of our 8 key strategies for reaching our plan goals. And we meant that in a very broad way. Like, we're not going to achieve our housing goals. We're not going to achieve our economic goals. We're not going to achieve our environmental goals unless we address equity. And here's where my guilt comes in. I will say our follow-up on that and how we address that wasn't too great. We did do an equity impact worksheet as part of our public participation plan. So we do have a little bit of process when we're starting to look at projects where we look at equity. And we did start a leadership training program for young people of color with an AmeriCorps equity coordinator. However, I think one of the things that happened at that time for us was, I mentioned we had 60 partners in this planning effort. When we started to focus on this equity work, it seemed like everybody was at different tables and we were at the table by ourselves after a little while. And so for whatever reasons, I'm not casting blame, but it kind of stalled out at that point in time. And so then comes 2020, right? Things are changing. We're working from home, George Floyd, so many things out there, but race is now back on the table. Equity is back on the table. Our school districts, students are petitioning to fly Black Lives Matter flags. I would say probably half our school districts are flying those flags right now. And we also had data about COVID disproportionately impacting Black and Brown residents. And so by the end of the spring, our largest city, Burlington, had developed a declaration declaring racism as a public health emergency and asked partner organizations in our community to sign on to it. I signed on to it on behalf of our organization and about 30 other organizations. So really the leading organizations, the Chamber of Commerce, the hospital, the university, and a bunch of other ones signed on to that declaration. And it was a little quick. I think the mayor gave us 4 days to decide to sign on to it or not. And so on the good side, none of us went to our boards. On the bad side, none of us went to our boards. And you know, the CEOs that felt like they could signed on to this, and we did. And so, and as part of the declaration, it wasn't just like, yes, this is bad, somebody ought to do something. There was a deliberate effort for each of us as organizations to make commitments about what we would do to address this issue. And so we committed to do a number of things that are, you know, frankly, we're still in the beginning stages of starting with. Sorry, I thought I muted that. We can talk a little bit more about what some of those things are, but I think we're looking at how to promote a better understanding in our region about really the systemic racism policies that are embedded maybe in our land use policies and how we make transportation investments, in banking, hiring, procurement. So we are really at the beginning stages of doing that work. And also, you know, some of the other tougher things like who is actually on our local government boards and commissions, and are we being really inclusive? Sorry, the quick answer to that is no. But there's work to do. And on the good side, I've been going around to each of our local elected bodies this fall, there's a readiness to do some work in this area that wasn't there 7 years ago. So I'm a little bit encouraged, and we'll talk more about where we're going from here, but thank you.
Thank you all. All three of you all touched on how you are partnering with the community, focus groups, training programs, working with local government entities. The topic of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion can cause conflict. It's an uncomfortable conversation for a lot of people. How are you able to work internally with staff and your board to change that concept to something that's positive? And also, being that all three of you all are in predominantly white communities, is there the mindset, we don't need this? And if so, how do you change the mindset of diversity is more than just Black versus white or racism? How are you able to tie all those things in so you can be effective internally to go externally?
I'll go first because I probably have done the least. We internally, you kind of asked about staff, board, and then other community partners. At the staff level, I mean, this was, you know, just really heartening. They just grabbed right onto it. We are now, mostly because of COVID, we're having more frequent staff meetings weekly. And every other staff meeting, we are actually having a discussion on this topic, some part of this topic. Next week, we're talking about what happened in Vermont in the early part of the 20th century when they had a eugenics program for real in Vermont, and we're sterilizing people of color and other things going on, indigenous people. And so we're going to talk about that. And so we're just kind of learning, but staff have fully embraced it. And then we've brought it to the board. And we've made a commitment there every other board meeting we're talking about this topic. The the head of our Racial Justice Alliance here came and spoke with them at our last meeting, and healthy conversation. And then you get to the tougher part, like, is everybody really bought in? And no, it's been interesting. There are some people that I thought would be much harder to sell, but they had a personal experience somewhere along the way that has them bought in. And then there are others that I thought might be more open to the conversation that are surprisingly afraid of it. And so, and I'm not going to mince too many words as I talk to each of our local towns. There are some towns or some people on some of those elected bodies that we don't have a race problem. I'm colorblind. There's all kinds of things that are being said at those. In my county, it's a little bit better than in the rest of the state, I think, because we're a little more urban, a little more left-leaning. Not to be political, but it's true. And so the conversations may be a little bit easier right now, but I think we've been trying to just prepare each other for the fact that some of these conversations are going to get tough, and it's okay. It's part of the process. So
we started, Jasmine, with the team being very excited about this kind of work and about thinking about our role and really diverging into whether or not we should steer or row, and if not us, who would consider this work given all of the things that were happening in the region. We did start internally so that we could somewhat practice what we were preaching, and it wasn't necessarily about just race diversity. It was all diversity, about how do we bridge cultural diverse cultures in terms of LGBT, in terms of low income, in terms of persons with disabilities, the whole gamut. So diversity started with a very broad focus, but we did start to look at our own internal policies, our lending practices, and change some of those, and our planning practices. Not just who was engaged in the planning, but who does the planning impact was a really important focus for us as planners. We did start to focus on the reduction of barriers for minority folks to participate in our work, like language barriers, and we did focus on our own purchasing, and we started to mentor differently with our colleagues across the region in terms of what are we trying to do and for whom. The whom mattered, and we started to measure differently as well. And I think the measurement around how do we measure this work and social cohesion and cultural bridging is difficult, but we really dove into that space as an organization. The entire team of 9, our region is much like Lisa's, large geographic area, about the same amount of people, predominantly white. And so to your question about how did you then take what you were doing internally and then externally make that something that was plausible for the region to talk about. I mean, our groups that were meeting, the 8 communities that we started in our welcoming community advocacy groups, quarterly we're talking about the exact same things, that list that Lisa talked about. Those are the same kinds of topics we were talking to quarterly in every single one of these 8 groups of folks who were private, public, nonprofit, and students brought together to create these groups of folks. And I mean, I will tell you that as we get into the next phase of this conversation about lessons learned, is that we learned we still have a whole lot to learn. I will tell you that, and that transition into what we were doing internally into how we were able to externally communicate with our region. Really, the JEDI worked. We knew it was not going to happen unless there were real, trusted, authentic relationships with people who are in community. Nothing against consultants who come in and do this work, but for us and our regional culture, it had to be people who were vested in this, who were willing to do it for the long haul. I will tell you that set the stage for us to be able to have these very difficult conversations with some folks who were feeling very, very threatened. And we can discuss sort of what that looked like later, but I do want to leave time for Lisa to respond to this.
So I would say we started internally as well, and really at an educational level. We needed to learn all of those things that I said that we were bringing in trainers for, and especially me. You know, I grew up with a lot of white privilege and not knowing that I had it. And we get the kinds of conversations that Charlie said, people that think there's no problem to be solved, that the current laws prevent discrimination, and that trying to be more inclusive is just reverse discrimination or special treatment for other populations. So there's definitely resistance on our board and in the community in those conversations that we have that, you know, we're white and there's no problem. But there is a problem and we see it. I think we've not done definitely in some ways as much as Cheryl has in really reaching broadly throughout our community in our conversations. You know, we've been focused pretty much at the nonprofit level. And although we're trying to make sure that we're listening more to other folks that haven't traditionally been in places of power and influence, I don't think that it's really impacting our planning that much at this point. It's hard. It's hard to change the way you do things. It's hard to bring up the conversations when it's uncomfortable. What we have had is like a lot better response from the programs that we're offering. So like our business planning classes and our individual development account, people are coming to us now because we have a reputation of supporting DEI concepts and being kind of the leader in the region. So more people are coming to us that can benefit from the programs and services that we provide.
Thank you, Lisa. With everything you all said, economic development plays a portion into that to help things in regions become more equitable. In your strategy or strategic planning, how are you able to make sure JEDI is incorporated into economic development? And can you touch on projects that you are currently working on that reflect that?
So when we talk about planning and how does JEDI fold into that, yes, it can fold into the SEDS through a focus about the who does this economic strategies benefit or who does it not benefit. But there are other areas, to your point, Jasmine. We've started doing energy environment planning because we understand that somewhat of an out of balance, undiversified market-based economy can certainly, it can foster some racial and income injustices. And we understand that. That can cause harm to our natural resources that we all really depend on, right? So we've started doing some story circles in addition to the energy environment planning where we brought in artists to interpret these conversations in ways that help tell the story differently so that people can resonate with it and it's not just academia or planner speak. We started doing some rural communities equity action guide with some partners in the region that incorporates the Wealth Works model and building the 8 forms of wealth and building from assets, which as planners we're taught to do, right? But it with a twist of understanding how would you understand if systems changes were happening, to Charlie's point earlier, if you were doing, if you were building those forms of capital, you were doing economic development through your built capital, through your environmental capital, through your policy, like what systems changes would actually occur as a result of a path you're taking or would not, right? So that Rural Communities Equity Action Guide started us to really focus on the systems change pieces of it. We're doing a lot more mapping with our project with a fellow RDCs, and we started in the somewhat of a danger zone for RDOs, and we have launched a criminal justice consortium and starting conversations around what is the story in rural places? Do folks have the need to be fearful of going to predominantly white communities in rural places of our nation or not? And how do we know what the reality is until we're telling our own stories? And if our story isn't so good, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to make those changes? So criminal justice consortiums with law enforcement and community members, tough stuff, but we're engaged. And then there are several other learning initiatives. I'm really proud of Minnesota, the Minnesota Association of Development Organizations as a state. All of the regional development organizations have committed to having all of their planning staff go through training together, so that as we're looking at our water plans or our environment plans or our SEDS, we can start to understand, where does this speak to predominantly privilege and white culture and patriarchal systems, and where are there areas that we can potentially disrupt some of that in ways that don't completely dismantle all of our communities at one time. And so there's work that's going on across the state for planners. I hope that answered some of your question.
It definitely answered it. Charlie, did you have something you wanted to chime in on?
You know, I was trying to think about answering, you know, where have we kind of try to put some of this into practice. So two efforts that I in my mind are related, but I'm not sure we've got it fully baked yet. One is because housing is such an issue in our region. We got together with the Affordable Housing Partners and started a Building Homes Together campaign. But, you know, and we started that about 4 years ago now. But in retrospect, I noticed we are not tracking race within that conversation. We're just saying, you know, we need to be building more housing and more housing that's affordable in our community in general and in the right places. There's a big smart growth element to it. But we're not really looking at, and there was a goal of 20% affordable, but we're not looking at how we're affecting home ownership rates. You know, in our city of Burlington, if you're Black in Burlington, only 4% of you own your homes. You know, that's compared to what 70% is the kind of national average. That is way out of whack. And we know, you know, how do you build wealth and right? I mean, a lot of it is through home ownership. So, so that's an area where I think we were trying to do something good, but maybe haven't hit the target right. And then right now we have an interstate going through our region, and we're looking at improvements in the core there. And we're really trying to figure out how to do an equity impact assessment and make sure this is not just benefiting white upper class suburban communities, and especially if it's at the detriment of more urban and, you know, diverse communities. So I don't have any great successes to report. Work in progress.
Yeah, and that's awesome. A work in progress is better than what most people are doing, and just having the conversation around it. You all mentioned economic development as it relates to housing, affordable housing. One major issue in rural communities is transportation. If you do not have transportation, then you're not able to work. You're not able to provide for your family. You're not able to be integrated into a community that will allow you to thrive. How are RDOs able to assist with transportation needs? Because that does reflect diversity, equity, and inclusion. People who have modes of transportation are going to be more successful, or access to transportation are going to be more successful than those who do not. If anyone would like to expand on what they're doing as it relates to transportation.
We're not doing anything. So that's not an area that we address at all.
Very lightly, I will add on, we are very steeped and engaged in what's called Rural Transportation Coordination Councils. They are across the state of Minnesota, created by our state DOT. I think that we internally as an organization, given the Welcoming Communities work, have been thinking about, well, what kind of difference can we make for communities that are low income or have barriers to transportation, Jasmine, to your point. The best that we've been able to do is really start a volunteer driver training program at this point, so that we can get more volunteer drivers, because you know, transit is fixed transit systems are very expensive and difficult for rural places with geography issues. And so I think the approach has been to figure out how do we help more volunteer drivers. And drivers, by the way, that speak different languages is how that is incorporated into DEI. Drivers that learn that also have an understanding about different cultures, and so that those experiences for those riders can be as honorable as possible.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. So we are the MPO for our region, so we're doing transportation planning. And one of the outcomes out of our Sustainable Communities Grant was actually investing in our United Way for a volunteer driver program that they call Neighbor Rides, which was a good partnership because United Way recruits tons of volunteers, but they were seeing the transportation need for residents, probably mostly older, frankly, but also with disabilities. And so these are more like elderly and disabled transportation services. And that's been marginally successful. We've worked with them and the transit providers over the last 2 years to work on a strategic plan to better address those needs. So that is happening. And then I just recently joined the board of our transit agency, and we have a pilot going for a micro transit program where they actually pulled back, or they're going to pull back on some of their fixed route transit. They have like 2 or 3 routes, small, serving a small town, and they're going to go to more of a micro on-demand transit system. So much more flexible, but hopefully more inclusive, and more people should be able to use it. So we're really curious to see how that pilot goes.
Well, as you can see, each of you have different strategies and things in place as it relates to the transportation and the housing needs. To our audience listening now, if there was a blueprint on where to start with the community, if you could name some of those organizations that you're partnering with. Charlie brought up a great point. He's on a board through local government that correlates back to the mission of his RDO. So how, well, if there is a blueprint to start, what would that look like? And what are some of those community organizations that you are a part of or that you can connect with to help you?
I'll pick that up. So the transit thing was really recent, but after we initially did this work and I saw the equity issues in our community, there were 2 boards that I got on. One was our affordable housing developer, and I remain on that board. And the other one was, we have one low income credit union, CDFI, and I got on there, and that actually, they really specialize in dealing with folks that are typically unbanked or unbankable by the traditional banking system, and they've really specialized with the refugee community, and so they have very diverse staff, and actually one of the things I'm really proud of right now is that they've just been working with some other financial institutions in the state to develop non-racist underwriting procedures, and so that's probably the wrong term, but you know what I mean. And so that is something. So and I think with the United Way I mentioned, and our medical center is also, I think, concerned about disparities in health outcomes for race and income, and so we really have a pretty strong partnership. The other thing that came out of our work has been a public health alliance. And it's most of those 30 organizations that I mentioned signed on to that racism is a public health emergency declaration are at a table of a public health alliance. We did a lot of work over the last few years on opioids. It's now turned to much more, broader topics, but racism is the topic of at least the next couple of years. So I'll leave it at that. But I think you're right, that was key to make those contacts and kind of build the stronger web together. And I think that's the conversation I have with my peers, is that we're all in this community together, and we're going to solve big problems by working together.
The consortiums across the nation, Jasmine, are so different. The cultures are different in each parts of our states, and so in our regions. And so the who we partner with to do this work will be it'll look different in every region, in all across the nation. And so, I mean, we can rattle off a list of all kinds of folks who may, be able to partner with us that seem logical to start with inquiries and knocking on doors and say who else is interested in this. But for me, it's less about, and who's at the table is important, right? And making sure that you're having folks that are in this for the long haul. But we have really thought more about the approach that we're taking. And the approach, whereas especially in rural places, which is all I know about, that the approach is done in a way that amongst our partnerships that are done in a way that need not cause shame for people's worldviews. As people are who they are, they come from where they come from. We all start from someplace, and our paths and our perspectives hopefully will shift through this work as we become more culturally agile, as we like to say. So I think, that's important. Everyone comes from a different place, their journey. And I'll tell you, in the how that we're doing this, for some folks, we're moving way too fast. And for other folks, we're moving way too slow. And as practitioners, when I talk about the how, it's important that we ebb and flow with the needs of our communities and our individuals. So when you're creating those consortia, make sure that they have real, authentic relationships in community so that they understand how we can quickly shift and ebb and flow as we do as planners to meet communities and individuals where they are. And I think that's important as we talk about this, because I've been in lots and lots of national conversations where folks will say, you need to begin and get people to a place of being uncomfortable before there is personal growth, right? And that's true. And it sounds very plausible. I do not disagree with that. But what we've learned as part of our work is that everyone is at a different starting point, as I said, and their different passions about diversity, equity, inclusion. If you're passionate about LGBT community, your point of discomfort on a scale of using the alphabet might be at a S or a T. But people in my community might be, that are not passionate about LGBT rights, are probably more at a G, right? And so that point of discomfort comes at an individual place. And that's really important that we understand that. We've learned from many folks that these conversations, this is the first time they're having these conversations around JEDI culture in our regions. And we need to desire and engage these conversations in a way that's, it's definitely been more urban, at least that's my experience, versus rural. And it has, as a result of the George Floyd murder and Breonna Taylor and other racial issues across our social unrest, that we have focused more on race. But what we've understood is, as I said earlier, that this entry point is different for everyone. For some, it's about goddamn time, right? And for others, it's like, we don't want to face this. This is really scary stuff. They're fearing a loss of culture, values, and that's a powerful force. And practitioners who are leading these conversations, what we've understand in these groups that Charlie's talking about, we have to go with intention of helping people, or helping them open up those conversations where they are. Because if you don't, people will fight or flight, right? They'll get in either one of those zones, and that closes the conversation altogether. It damages the trust, and it moves away any area of potential growth. I know that's a soapbox, so I say those consortiums are important, but it's more important to have a dialogue that, yes, embraces discomfort. You be disruptors, go be disruptors, but be, as planners, as vulnerable as we are asking our community members to be, and lead this work and help in ways that help growth rather than shame. And then appreciate and celebrate those little victories, and then keep pushing for more, right? So I think the consortiums are important, but I really think the path and the approach is almost more important.
Well said, Cheryl. I mean, be intentional in your disruption. Lisa, did you have anything you want to add to that about your partnering with other organizations to help this effort?
So I would say for us, one of the things that's been really important is connecting with urban-based organizations and organizations that are not in our region that give us a different perspective on life and living in this world that we don't have. So that's been really important for us understanding perspectives. I mean, a very simple recent realization for me that isn't necessarily racial, but I'm in this coalition with a group of folks that is primarily BIPOC-led organizations serving entrepreneurs. And one of their biggest concerns in Portland right now is evictions of small businesses that have been closed for a long time, or suffering from COVID impacts, and not having rent relief that's going to continue for them, and how they're going to be, those individuals that own those very small businesses are going to be declaring bankruptcy because they're personally liable for their rent, for their leases. And as I go out into our community and ask those types of questions, we're not seeing that same type of impacts right yet anyway. And it's like, why is that? Well, rents aren't as high here. And maybe people are more willing to work with their community, their leasees, and leasers are talking to each other maybe a little bit more. But it's one of those things that probably wouldn't have come to my attention as being a problem if I hadn't had the connection with people in another area and understood that this is really a problem that needs to be addressed in policy and response to the pandemic that we're in. So that's, I mean, just a simple example, but there's all sorts of different types of examples that I get being in conversation with people that are in a different place, living a different life experience. And locally, I mean, I'm on our Northeast Oregon Networks board, which is a community health organization. And so I have connections there, understanding those that don't have health care and what impacts are happening in that situation. One of our good connections has been with a domestic violence shelter that also has a specific program addressing LGBTQ issues and trying to fight for equity for that population. And the multicultural service providers at our local university have also been really great contacts and have helped us, and we're helping them get to the communities that they're serving.
Thank you, Lisa. With implementing JEDI, what are some lessons learned that you all have encountered? And what are some missing pieces of the puzzle that you wish your region had? Charlie, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so I think the pieces that have been good and that I've appreciated is the peer organizations in the community, the United Way, the Chamber, those kind of larger community organizations that we've been able to partner with. What's missing, I think we're all not at a table yet, and I actually appreciate what the other two panelists have been doing to kind of bring people together. We are not there yet. We don't have a central organizing table where these things are getting talked about. There is a racial justice alliance, but it's fairly urban Burlington focused and not more regionally focused. And so I'm actually talking with them now to see, can we pull some of their conversations out and have broader. And the other good thing is our state legislature a year or two ago passed some legislation to hire a diversity and inclusion director. And so that we actually have our Republican governor now kind of pushing some equity impact work from the state level. So some pieces are coming together. I'm hopeful some more will happen to meld it together and make it stronger.
So for me, the missing pieces, if we'll just focus on that, because Jasmine, would be more practitioner circles that can help each other understand how to show up in this space. And and more conversations around how are we measuring results so that we can get to those systems changes and see what we call equitable economic ecosystems. And so that's important. And then we have hired mentors like Lisa has drawn on experience of folks from different worldviews. We've hired mentors for our staff to be able to understand more and ask questions, the really, really tough questions that, you know, are deep in your hearts and you're afraid to say out loud, but we talk about those things and with our mentors. And so providing more mentors or finding them is what's missing for lots of my colleagues that are doing that work. So that those are the missing pieces that I see, but the training circles or the practitioner circles where we're really talking about what's working and what's not working is for us the hardest. We're starting to do more of that in Minnesota, but through COVID, it's really transcended into more of the similar kinds of training around privilege, around some of the things that are important foundational pieces of these conversations, but not how do you do it when you're in the room, back of the room or the front of the room or the side of the room, but how do you start those circles that Charlie's talking about is his next step.
So I'm thinking about making sure you know why you're doing what you're doing. So find your why and don't go alone. Try to find other people that can go along with you and explore and that you can talk through the things you don't understand and concepts that don't make sense to you yet, because I've certainly been there. I'm like, well, I don't understand this. And I mean, talking to my white colleagues that have other experiences that can help me like, oh yeah, that's it. So just being able to have really open and honest conversations and recognize you're not the expert, you don't know what you're doing, and you're gonna be fumbling along, you're gonna make mistakes. And even a small step is a step. Maybe you're gonna go around in some circles, but you're gonna make progress along a road. And I would love to say that we're gonna get to the end point that we want to get to, but I think that's a long road and that's a long journey. But if we can start taking small steps to get along that journey and not go backwards and not get stuck, that will help. And be realistic about the culture that you're within and what is the starting point that you can start with. And there's lots of missing pieces.
Jasmine, I want to pick up, Cheryl kind of mentioned, and as Lisa, kind of the outcomes. And I've been kind of pushing my conversations with the Racial Justice Alliance of like, hey, can you help us? I have some ideas like, is it about, you know, median, you know, household income? Is it home ownership? Is it employment? You know, there could be lots of different metrics. And certainly we could talk about education and health outcomes and things like that. And I don't know, to me, sometimes I think those are some of the symptoms, but you know, like if we hit 2 or 3, we really actually made the shift on some key indicators, like that would help us focus a lot. And I really come to that out of the opioid work, where we had deaths and we had waiting lists for treatment. And our community really like galvanized, we were going to change those outcomes. And we did in like 24 months. Our waiting list is 0. Our deaths went down maybe like 80%. Like it was a tremendous focusing effort. And maybe those exist. And to Cheryl's point, maybe I'm not at the right tables to know what those outcome measures should be. But it would provide us a lot more focus in this work. So sorry, that was the planner.
Charlie, part of the conversation around measurement when we talk about that is for instance, what I would ask you as your friend and colleague is, when you were thinking about those reduction in deaths, who and where, right? That back to Lisa's point of you have to know why you're doing this work and what is the purpose. Like reduction in deaths is a good goal. in and of itself. But the equity piece that layers it and makes it more important is the who and the where. Are those deaths, are those reduction of deaths in communities of which you seek to shift the demographics in?
Well,
Or
and that
not.
was an interesting conversation, right? Why did the community rally around opioids when we'd had all kinds of other issues for years? Because it went into white suburbia and like, oh, now we're going to focus on this issue.
Right.
So anyway, sorry, tangent.
Yeah.
Well, to stick to our timeline, you all kind of touched on it. What is some advice that you would offer to your colleagues or anyone that's attending this session? And after we do that, we'll take some questions from the audience. So any advice that you would like to offer as they go on their JEDI journey?
I mean, mine will be very short. I like support of the board and the staff. I've always been a person that believes in feeding staff passion. And so I wanted support of staff as well. It's not incidental that, hey, you're going to go do this now. It's got to be something they have in their heart and soul as well. I think asking community members about their experiences, that Lisa talked about that a little bit, that's really important. The only other advice I'd say is that, you know, I believe that this work does expend some agency social capital, but I believe it's worth it. And you've all talked about that as well. And so that's why it's important, because you are expending agency social capital, that the board understands that's exactly what's happening. Yeah, I mean, the advice that I give, because it's so difficult, this work is so difficult, is to extend grace even when you don't think it's deserved. And that's hard, right? Measure, 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 keep measuring, keep trying to measure, because we do what we measure. And then I really believe that make changes. Knowledge is powerful, and I love all these conversations because I think they're fundamental. We have to understand the bias and the privilege and understand where we're coming from in order to be able to have real systems changes, but seek systems changes. I feel a sense of urgency. I'm getting old, and I really want to see systems changes happen. I don't want the same kind of discrimination happening in the world that my grandchildren are being raised in. So I'm looking for real systems changes that sort of, and I'm hoping my colleagues are too, that help us get to those equitable economic ecosystems and what I've called JEDI euphoria. You know, like, let's find the ways that we can actually really make things change. That's the advice I try to give folks, is do what you're doing, keep going, stay at the pace you are, and then keep going, as Lisa said, but push yourselves even harder and further than you thought was possible, because that's where we're going to get to some real change.
Well said, Cheryl. Charlie or Lisa, did y'all want to follow up on that before we take some questions from the audience?
Lisa.
So for us, one of the things that was really important was to get some funding in order to be able to do the work. I mean, our organization is tiny. We get no local government support. So we have to find a funder that will help us do anything that we do. And so that was critical. I mean, if we didn't have the funding, we wouldn't be doing this work. And we wouldn't be nearly as, you know, we wouldn't be doing the work externally, but we probably wouldn't also be doing the work internally that we've been doing. So for us, figuring out the funding model to engage in the work was a critical piece. And it's a shame, but I mean, that's just reality, and it's pragmatic. We had to figure out how to cut out a piece of our time to think differently and to learn. And so if you're in that situation, find a funder that will help you do that part. And everything that Cheryl said.
Yes.
What they said, I'll just kind of offer on the funding side. We got permission from Federal Highway to use some of our MPO funding for this work. So that was, thanks Lisa for bringing that up. That is kind of a critical aspect. And then I would just real simply say, you know, partnership, patience and perseverance. And you need to be willing and have the support of your board to be able to take some of those risks that Cheryl was talking about, because this is not easy conversations, and you know, you will get the question like, why are you even talking about this? Like,
Yep.
you know, we're more of a planning organization than even an economic development organization. And so like, why, you know, we like it when you guys talk about buildings and roads and stuff. And so, but that's just, you know, perseverance. I think like this is what's going to matter in the long term. And I think Cheryl said it well. So thank you.
Great advice for your colleagues. And now we'll take some questions from the audience. I'll kick off with the first one. This one is actually from a comment Charlie made, but it's addressed to me. Charlie, you brought up the problematic comment that perhaps is made without intended harm, but can actually be very harmful. And that phrase is, I'm colorblind, that he has heard people in his community say. Jasmine, can you speak to why that kind of phrase or idea can be harmful and what are the dangers of that? So when I hear people say, oh, I'm colorblind, I don't see color, I think of my 5-year-old son. You ask him, hey, what color is that house? What color is that car? How short or how tall someone is. When you see people, you see people. So it's harmful when people don't recognize that they view things initially off. You're judging how you see someone. You judge how a grocery store looks. You judge someone on the shoes that they may wear. So you see color, you see people's skin tone. So when people say that to me, I'm like, ask your child, ask your niece, your nephew, ask the neighbor's children. So I think about the childlike mindset, which is innocent, that carries on with us as an adult. Let's see.
I had a pastor in our community say, when you say that to me, you're telling me that you don't see me.
Right.
I thought that was,
That's powerful. Yep.
Yeah, well
there are
said.
differences that make a difference, and color is one of them, right? And so we can value difference.
Absolutely. This next question, all three speakers have used the word privilege, an important concept. Can you all expand on what that may mean? And how do you explain to others that you work with who see a lot of white households in poverty? Good question.
Lisa, do you want to go first, or Charlie?
So I'll give it a stab, and it'll be part of the answer. So it's unearned privilege that we have as white people, that if you don't have that privilege, I'll stumble along. It doesn't have to do with the effort that you put into your work that you get an outcome, or that you live with a different feeling when you go down the street. So it's all of the things that come with being a white person or being a person of color that are maybe unseen, but have real effects on your outcomes. And that's a stumbling answer.
One of the ways that we explain privilege is that, particularly my white privilege, is that there's not a room in this nation, including the White House, that I'm afraid to walk into or that I don't feel like I belong. That's privilege, right? So there are lots of folks, Indigenous people, people of color, LGBT, where there is a real fear about being in a place, sundown towns, right? All of these other areas that we know about, and that's privilege, and we do have it. And I want to just admit to you straight up, these words hurt at first. Privilege, anti-racist, racist, you know, all of these things, their first reaction as a white person is, ouch, I'm doing what I can, I'm doing the best I can, and I blah, 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 and all these excuses come out. But the reality is, it is what it is, right? We do have this privilege when we walk into a room that other folks don't have. Now, as a feminist, I understand that Charlie carries more privilege than I do when he walks into a room. And every day, our job is to think about how do we become anti-racists to dismantle that privilege in ways that we all have access. And my job is to take that privilege that I have, recognize it, and use it. Use it to make sure that my brothers and sisters have equitable access, appreciating their difference, appreciating their different perspectives and worldviews and cultures, but also using that privilege in ways that really changes the inequities that we have today.
I guess one of the things that I think about is that just because I have the privilege doesn't mean that when I think about it, I don't want to give it up. I just want everybody else to have the same privileges. It's not a zero-sum game. I don't have to give up privilege necessarily in order for others to have privilege. I want to raise the boat for everybody, if that's possible.
That would be a fascinating conversation in some circles that I've been in. People would say, I'm not sure that's possible, that can actually happen.
I'm not sure that it's possible either. Right. But freedom from fear would be really good across the board.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I have anything to add to that other than I think Cheryl was really hitting on it strongly of, using the privilege that you have and the opportunities you have to open up opportunities and privilege for other people in your community that don't have that starting off. And I think, those videos where you see, who had two parents in their household, all those things, like those are great visuals to see, like people do start off in different places in life. And that's it's not a judgment thing. It's just, that is everybody's individual reality. But then you got to realize there are people that didn't have the same opportunities. What are you going to do about it to make your community better?
Because Jasmine, that impacts our economy, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's good economic development.
Great answers. This next question is for Lisa. She mentioned trainings for her organizations that they're currently doing, recognizing microaggressions, LGBTQIA inclusion, recognizing and challenging white privilege, etc. Lisa, can you talk about how you identify trainers who have the appropriate expertise to facilitate those trainings on those topics? And can you share organizations where those trainers came from, or advice for other RDOs on how they can implement those same trainings, because this is very important?
So it's been difficult to find trainers. And when we started out, we had no idea where we were going to get our trainers from. So the first place we looked was the Oregon Health Authority had a list of trainers that they had used for DEI subjects. So we kind of went to their website and tried to identify some. Where we've had in Oregon, the best source for us has been Oregon Humanities offers what they call conversation projects, and they have trained facilitators to lead those conversations. We've looked at their list of folks that do that and find ones that also are good trainers as well on these various topics. And that's been a really, really good source for us. We've also needed to find trainers. So we've stumbled a couple of times when we've brought in trainers that have a very urban perspective. And we now know to be pretty good in our pre-talks with the trainers about what they know about rural communities and the culture of those rural communities as they are coming in, because if we can't get a connection between the trainer and the group, it doesn't really matter what they say if we can't develop some sort of a bond between the trainer and the group as we go forward.
Thank you. We'll probably do another 2 more questions before we wrap it up. So this is a difficult question, but have any of you dealt with, or how do you address equity, diversity, and inclusion with people who just don't think addressing equity is important? Cheryl, you seem like you might be a great.
That's a good question.
So-
It's a really good question as to how to.
Because I smiled because I was trying not to be rude, you know, because my first response is, I'm probably moving on to the next person. And then if the question is, I've got a 3-person elected body for the town, and, you know, one of them, so this is not a problem. You know, I'm probably not dealing with it at the town meeting. And, you know, maybe I'll see if they're open to some private conversation, you know, separately some other time. But I'm also, I don't know, I start to get to a point and maybe I'm just getting, you know, grumpy old man stage or something, but like life is too short for some of these conversations if it's not critical to moving forward. You know, if you can move around them, but I'm not sure that's great advice, but that was just where my head went.
I mean, we've tried to reach out to folks who didn't think equity was important. At one point in time, I have to tell you, we were at an event and first time, not through any of the sustainable communities did we ever get picketed. It wasn't until we started doing this work, we actually got picketed by folks who don't think that, you know, that there is an equity issue in our region, and that really saw it, in the words of some leadership, as anti-American, anti-Christian, anti, right? And so when, much to Charlie's point, when we got to that point, we tried to have dialogue with folks to help them understand why it was important to embrace all types of diversity and embrace, and not just racial diversity, but bridging cultures of poverty, or even veteran cultures or youth cultures or other cultures, and try to make it approachable to them. That did not work. It was a failure. And so we had to learn through the hard way that yeah, if there's 20% that just don't want to talk about it, then by gosh, go with a cohort of the willing and try to create real changes and put people in leadership that really reflect the values of a majority of the region, which is that equity is important. And we cannot be competitive economically without diverse populations who are, because our demographics are changing. So it comes down to a raw economic issue as well. And if folks don't care about environment, our prosperity, then any of those things that include equity pieces to it, then yeah, we have to, as Charlie said, move on to a cohort of the willing people who do.
I think the other thing we can also do is try to figure out what their values are and what their goals are, because sometimes that does lead an opening for further discussion, like how do you get there? So it's easier if you don't have to go backwards to that, but that's sometimes a way to have a conversation that opens the door to further conversations and acceptance of these kinds of concepts.
I completely agree with Lisa Jasmine on that. I just want to share with you, there will be people who say, get rid of all your Section 8 housing, deport all of your immigrants. There are folks that their values, when you understand what they care about, are really going to be disruptive to society.
Well, we are running out of time. This was a great conversation. I hope the audience gained a lot of insight from our wonderful panelists today. Please remember at 12:30 to 1:30, there are going to be breakout sessions. There's not going to be any presentations. It'll be a way for everyone to connect with each other. So from 12:30 to 1:30, those topics will be aging, internal communications, youth engagement, ADA, CARES Act. Their schedule is block parties. But I also will encourage you all to meet with someone at this conference that may be different from you and see what you have in alike with one another, because that's the way we're going to be able to change the world and implement JEDI. So thank you so much.